Hey, what's up everybody? This is Clint coming to you with part 5 of my sit and go series, and this will be the last video in the series, and we're going to be getting into post flop and heads up play today. Two topics that I think aren't really talked about enough, or a lot or enough for that matter, when it comes to sit and goes. But I think that they're extremely important, especially heads up play. It can really have an impact on your ROI, and it's an area, like I said, it hasn't been discussed a lot. A lot of people revert to charts, such as like Nash equilibrium, and we're just going to talk about how to get a bigger edge over your opponents. So, just as a recap of the previous sessions, and if you haven't seen these videos yet, I definitely recommend watching them from the beginning and going straight through in order. Especially with the first part where we do HUD and hold manager setup. That's kind of the basis for exploiting our opponents. From there, we use those stats to talk about stealing in some pretty unconventional spots. Session 3 we talked about anti-strategies, using what we know of how players are supposed to play, and using that information against them to get even a bigger edge, and also talking about how to exploit even the fishy players and picking up chips from them in, again, some unconventional spots. Unconventional and exploiting has obviously been the main theme of all the videos. And session 4, which is one of my favorite sessions, talks about the good old 10 big blind shove, and when it's actually okay to play a raise fold or raise call game, and how that can be even more profitable than your standard or traditional and very often preached push fold strategy. So as I said, today we're going to be getting into some post-flop play and heads up. When it comes to post-flop play, naturally, the strategies that we've talked about in the previous sessions means we're going to be opening up a lot more hands, doing a couple, doing strategies such as the limp steal, which naturally will lead to more post-flop play. You're opening more hands, you're playing some more pots, and you're going to be, like I said, in some more post-flop scenarios. So accordingly, we got to have a pretty good post-flop game so that that our plays aren't going to get us in trouble and we're not going to be losing chips. That we want to continue to maximize our expected value and gain value from all of our plays. And then we'll jump into some heads-up play. All right, so first part about post-flop play, and what we're going to be talking about here is obviously c-betting. This is basic stuff. We know about c-betting. C-betting's probably one of the more common, taught strategies, or commonly discussed post-flop strategies throughout many videos, forums, and coaching sessions. So this is nothing new, but it's going to be the basis for some of the other plays that we're going to be making. And like I said, post-flop play is not discussed a ton. Post-flop play is usually discussed more in cash games. And the reason it's not discussed a whole lot is because simply sit and goes have become more of that push fold game, not really playing post flop, c-betting, double barreling. But it is going to be part of our game now, and we're going to hopefully do it better than everybody else. I am by no means a post flop play expert. I'm going to be talking about the strategies that I use and I find most effective. I definitely suggest watching the other great cash game videos that are on Bluefire to get some even more advanced strategies for playing post flop. I used to play some cash games, play a lot of live cash games, so I do have a good background in playing post flop, probably more than the average sit and go player. But it's always good to get some other videos, because we're going to be going through strategies here. We're obviously not going to get into a ton of depth, because post-flop play offers a lot of different variables, and to get into it fully would require hours and hours of video. So what we're going to be talking about here are some general strategies and different plays that, of course, like all the other stuff we've talked about, add different plays to add into your repertoire and at least get you thinking. Remember, that's the other common theme here, is getting everybody back to thinking and not just playing the robotic style of play. And the robotic style of play many times also falls when it comes to c-betting, as most people will bet if they get called, they c-bet. If they get called, they shut down, and it becomes very easy to play against that player. So let's just start from the beginning here with c-betting and when to c-bet. Obviously, when you're deciding on when to c-bet, you want to look at board texture, and of course, it's player dependent. Having stats on players would be great. When it comes to post-flop stats, very, very often you're just not going to have a ton of stats on the players. For one, as we know, regs very, very rarely call pre-flop, so you're not playing against them post-flop a ton, and those are usually the players you have the most stats on. The guys that are calling you and that you're playing against post-flop are usually the looser players, and they're the ones that you're not seeing every single day. They're the more random players, fishy players, and you just simply won't have a ton of stats on them. So when it comes to being player dependent, we have to use kind of what we know in general about that player type, whether it's a loose player, really aggressive player, and we can use obviously just the VPIP and preflop raise to get an idea of the general category that that player fits into. Then when it gets to good boards to c-bet, and we'll talk about board texture, and again, this should be pretty straightforward stuff, but high card boards are great to c-bet against really any player. Ace high boards, king high boards, queen high boards. They're easy to represent. If an opponent doesn't have one of those cards, and it's the high card on the board, like if the flop comes ace 9-4, for example, and that player doesn't have an ace, they very rarely will continue on a board like that because there's not many draws, they don't have top pair, what are they really going to continue with? So if you find yourself checking back those types of boards, don't. Those high card boards are great to be c-betting. And suited boards, I'm sure people will disagree with me a little bit on this. I like to c-bet suited boards a lot, like if it's all hearts, all spades, all clubs, all of one suit. If your opponent doesn't have that suit, many times they will fold. So they can be good boards to c-bet. And another good board to c-bet are paired boards. Deuce deuce 5 or ace ace 7. So paired boards. Not all the time though. Sometimes they can lend themselves to the more aggressive players to check raise you with pocket pairs and stuff like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, and we're going to go through some hand history examples of some paired boards and when it might be good and not good to be c-betting those types of boards. And I like c-betting simply just against good players. And so against your ABC reg who may be flatting pre-flop to hit their set. I mean, that's most often when most regs are going to be flatting, is when they have a pocket pair and they're looking to hit a set against you. And I will c-bet them, and those are players I'm often going to double barrel as well. And again, we're going to get into double barreling. And in a perfect world, if a player has a high fold to c-bet, don't pass up that opportunity to c-bet them. Look over your pop-up, or if you don't have it in your HUD, look at your pop-up, look at their c-bet percentage. Even if you see 100% fold to c-bet and it's only over 5 hands, it's a good indication they're just calling to hit the board and they're going to fold to a c-bet. So look to c-bet those guys. We're going to get into bet sizing. Bet sizing is extremely important. We're going to get into that shortly here. So these are just, again, general considerations for c-betting, when and against which players. High card boards are probably your most common board to c-bet, so that's where we'll look to be c-betting most often. Now, what I want to get into first is a nice little strategy that I like to use. It's called the delayed c-bet or the turn c-bet. Many of you might be doing it already. Maybe you're doing it without even knowing you're doing it. And when you're doing it, I think there should be a good strategy behind why you should check back the flop. And the delayed c-bet will typically be when you're in position. And it's pretty simple. So you're in position. So let's say, for example, you are in the cutoff, you raise, the big blind calls you. Okay, so that we're in position on the big blind. And what we're going to do is we're simply not going to c-bet. We're going to check back the flop and bet any turn. Okay, so as I said, when do you want to do it? When we're in position. And you want to c-bet or do a delayed c-bet potentially on boards that are ultra dry, that may lend themselves to for a more aggressive opponent to check raise you. So for example, if you bet raise pre-flop, you get called, and the board comes 7-4-2 rainbow. Okay. everybody always expects you to c-bet. Like I said, it's a very standard play in today's game. C-betting is nothing new, and they expect you to c-bet almost every time that you raise pre-flop. So accordingly, the more aggressive players that understand that, or they're just figuring that you missed a flop like that as well, they may check raise you with ace high, even king high with the more aggressive players, and of course pocket pairs. If somebody called you with pocket fives, they're going to check raise you on a board like 7-4 deuce because they assume their pocket fives are good and you didn't raise with a 7. So those types of boards tend to lend themselves to a check raise, or even somebody floating and maybe you don't want to double barrel. So that's when you would want to do it on what type of board. And again, I'm not saying that you always have to do this. It's a play to add in when you're, especially you're up potentially against an aggressive opponent who's going to play post flop. Now, why do we do it? Quite simply, it's to kind of take the aggression away from that opponent. If anybody is going to make a move on you, it's typically on the flop. Someone wants to check raise you with ace high or a pocket pair, it'll typically be on the flop and not the turn. So therefore, the path of least resistance to essentially steal that pot, when you miss, is to check back the flop and bet out on any turn. Because if an opponent goes, they check the flop, you check, and then they check the turn, they're obviously saying they don't have much here. They went check check, so you can go ahead and bet out on the turn and do your delayed c-bet. In addition, let's say you also have some outs on the flop that you don't want. Maybe it's a draw heavy board that you have some outs, and you don't want to get check raised on that board and have to give up. You can also check back and potentially give yourself a free card. Okay, so those are why to do it and some advantages of doing it. There are obviously some disadvantages to take into consideration. One, you can also give your opponent a free card. And two, if you do check back the flop and the turn comes and they do bet out on the turn and you still missed, then you'll probably have to fold. So there are some disadvantages to it, but I find it very effective on those dry boards, and again taking away the aggression from opponents, and you may have an easier time of taking down the pot. When it comes to sizing for your delayed c-bet, it doesn't have to be very big, because think about what just happened. Our opponent just, first of all, they called pre-flop, they didn't raise us, and they checked twice to us. So do we need to bet big to represent the hand? Not really. My turn c-bet sizing is, I say 30 to 40%, 30 maybe on the low side. That's more in the rarer cases, I would say, but definitely less than 50%, and I'd say it's probably closer to 40% on average of my sizing. It doesn't have to be a very big bet, because again, think about what has happened in the hand thus far. Why would you bet big to represent a hand, especially when you miss? So that's a delayed c-bet. Like I said, you may be doing it, but you may not be knowing why you do it or when the best time to do it is. So I think, like I said, on those dry boards, even I said before, c-betting on paired boards can be a good board to c-bet. It can also be a bad board, because those boards also lend themselves for check raises, so they can be good boards to do a delayed c-bet as well. So that'll lead us into bet sizing. I find this is probably the most common error that most players make when they're making c-bets, turn bet, delayed c-bets, is just their sizing. I would say in general, I probably size my bets smaller than most people in general. But on average, I don't think you need to go much more than 50% of the pot on most flops. There's always times to go bigger, like you're against a loose, fishy player, and you're on a draw-heavy board and you have a made hand. It's fine to bet bigger in that case because you expect to get called by a lot of hands, right? That's fine. In general, again, we're going to be talking about what's going to happen most often. 50% or less of the pot, whether you hit or miss. Don't fall into the trap of betting bigger when you hit and betting smaller when you miss. That's one of those things that will become very obvious to most players if they're paying attention. Okay? So if the pot, for example, is 300, should be no more than 150, even 140, and what that will also allow you to do is double barrel easier. If you find yourself betting 60 or even 70% of the flop and you get called, that's going to make that turn bet very difficult, or the double barrel on the turn, make it very difficult on you. Many times, given standard stack sizes, they're going to represent a large portion or even commit you to the pot. So betting small on the flop for your C-bets will also allow you to bet small on the turn, but it'll look very strong because double barrels in general look strong. Okay, now like I said, there's always times to deviate. So like I said, made hand on a draw heavy board, you can bet bigger. And I see here, get fish to commit before action gets killed. What does that mean about action getting killed? I want fishy players to commit their chips with their draw, with their weaker hands when I think that they're able to commit with those weaker hands, before, let's say, a potential flush completes or a straight completes. I see many people too often they'll slow play a made hand on the flop. Like, for example, the flop comes 7, 8, 9, and they have 10 jack. Yes, they have the nuts, but that board may lend itself to an opponent that's calling you may hit their range as well, and they might commit themselves with a 10. They might commit themselves with top pair and a draw. And that's the players I want to get committed, because if, like on a 7, 8, 9 board, if a 6 comes out, if a 10 comes out, even a jack comes out, so there's 4 to a straight potential, those cards can kill the action. So we want to make sure we're getting our chips in as fast as possible, and that when those players will allow us to do so. And in general, when to deviate from that 50% or 40% rule, think about what your bet means and what's going to get the job done. Okay? Again, let's say, for example, you have king-queen. You raise pre-flop from the cutoff. The big blind calls you, and the flop comes ace-9-4, and we have king-queen. He checks. Do we need to bet very big on that type of board, on an ace-high board with no draws, to represent the ace? Too often, again, I see people representing the ace by betting big. On a board like that, for most players, when they're out of position, there's not much they can continue with if they don't have the ace. Of course, you get some guys that'll float you, or they refuse to give up. Fine, those players are always out there. But for the most part, if they don't have an ace on a board like that out of position, very few times will they continue. So you don't need to even bet 50%. You can go 40% or 35%. Okay? Always think to yourself, if I bet 60% or 40%, will they call with one but fold to the other? Many times that's not the case. Think about what your goal is when you're sizing your bets. So that'll get us into double barrel. And like I said before, we're going to have some hands to go through so that you can see some examples of some double barreling spots, some delayed c-bet spots. But double barreling is, again, another area, another strategy that's really overlooked when it comes to sit and goes, just because obviously our stacks are smaller. We're not dealing with 100 big blind stacks like you are in cash games. You don't have a lot of room to maneuver. That's okay. Like I said, we're going to be keeping our bet sizing small, and double barreling will be important, especially when you're doing plays like a limp steal. There's always times where you're going to limp, player's going to check, you're going to bet out, and they're going to call. That doesn't mean we have to fold or check and give up every time on the turn. You need to know when to double barrel and when not to double barrel. So when do we double barrel? Good turn cards. What are good turn cards? We're going to get into. I'll talk about that in a second when we get into the hand history. I think it'll be easier to show there. Also, double barreling is good when it doesn't commit you. That's why I say keep the bet sizing small. The last thing you want is to find yourself bluffing or getting yourself committed too often on the turn, essentially as a bluff, when you're double barreling. So try to make sure that you're not going to be committed. It's nice to give yourself some room to maneuver. Now, here's the third point here about when to do it. It's a strategy that I like to use, which again I don't think is used very often. If you're familiar with the term blocker bet, many times blocker bets are used by players when they're out of position on the river, they have showdown value, they bet a really small amount on the river to prevent their opponent from betting bigger or potentially raising, and allows them to see showdown cheaper. So they bet maybe like a third of the pot on the river. The double barrel can also be a blocker of sorts to see a cheap river by doing it on the turn. So let's say you're in position and the flop comes queen jack X and you have jack 10. So you have second pair. You c-bet the flop and a blank turn card comes. It's okay to go ahead and do a double barrel on the turn for a very small amount, maybe even 35%, so that you can see the river cheaply. Because what will happen very often, if that opponent does call the turn, you've just double barreled. They'll most likely check back to you on the river, and then therefore you can check down. So typically what I'll bet on the turn will be cheaper than what I think my opponent would potentially bet and put us to the test on the river. You know, if you bet the flop and your opponent calls and you check the turn, that's often a sign of weakness, and your opponent may feel that this is a good time to fire out a big bet on you on the river and really put you to the test and potentially make a crying call almost as a bluff catcher. Turning your hand into a bluff catcher for big pots can be very expensive, and sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong, and when you're wrong, it's, like I said, it's really expensive. So seeing a cheaper river can sometimes be done by making a small double barrel. And like I said, it's when you have showdown value, like second pair, and potentially also charge some draws as well. But like I said, the double barrel on the turn can almost allow you to see a potentially cheaper river. So that's one reason I like to play it as well. And of course, you can exploit player stats. In a perfect world, if you look at the pop-up of a player's breakdown in terms of their fold percentage on the flop and the turn, if you see that they may not fold the flop a lot, but they do fold the turn a lot, those can be players to double barrel. Again, that's a perfect world. Many times you won't have those exact stats, but when you do, take advantage of them. When not to double barrel, of course, when your opponent is a calling station, the last thing you want to do is start bluffing into a player who's not going to fold third pair. So know who the calling stations are. Don't bluff them too often. Another good reason not to double barrel is when you can improve on the river. So let's say we have ace queen of diamonds and the flop comes jack 10. Maybe we c-bet in position and we get called, and the turn brings us another diamond, and so essentially we have on the turn we have a flush draw, two overcards, and a gut shot straight draw. I would say in that case, when we're in position, I probably would not double barrel because we can improve on the river and potentially hit our hand to win. I don't want to get check raised potentially off my hand with all of those outs. So if I can improve on the river after my c-bet and the turn gives us some outs, I will typically check it back to give myself that free card. Now, if you can improve on the next street, that could be I didn't include it on the good reasons to double barrel or when to do it. But if you can improve on the river, you don't have those flush draws and straight draws, that could be another good reason to double barrel. And of course, bad turn cards, and we'll get into that as well. There's just certain cards that they'll be hard to represent. They won't change anything in the hand, and you just simply don't want to double barrel them. And in general, like I said, keep sizing small. The double barrel does look strong as is. So we don't need to bet 50% on the flop and then 60% on the turn. Going like 35 to 40 on the flop and 35 to 40 on the turn still looks strong by double barreling, but it's not going to really commit a ton of our stack when we don't want to. So another common post-flop scenario is you raise with kings, you get called, and the dreaded ace comes up on the flop. Think to yourself how you would play this hand when you're in position and when you're out of position, because they should typically be played differently and for very specific reasons. So I'll give you a second here to think how you would play these hands in position. When I pose this question to most of my students, the guys that I coach, I always get different answers on how they would play. So I think this is extremely important to bring up. So a couple seconds to think. All right, let's jump into it. Kings on an ace-high board. In position, I'd say 9 out of 10 times I'm checking back when I'm in position. Okay, let's take that situation before that I keep mentioning as far as a board and that ace-9-4. We're in position, we raise with pocket kings, we get called by the big blind. What's the point in betting that flop with pocket kings on that ace-high board with no draws? What are we getting value from? Like I said, most likely all that's going to call us is an ace, and everything that's going to fold we beat. So we're not really getting value from any hands, and we're not afraid of any turn cards coming because we have second pair. A queen comes out, a jack comes out, really doesn't change much. So I'm always checking back, or typically always checking back with kings on an ace-high board when I'm in position. Now, when we check and the turn comes, I will look to make a bet on the turn, most likely. A small bet to potentially get value. Maybe he doesn't think we have an ace at that point. Get value from any draws that are there now, any second pairs. And depending on how the board plays out, maybe do a really small bet on the river or just check it back. It's just one of those situations where you're not going to be getting tons of value at this point from your kings. So you just want to extract maybe a street or 2 small streets of value with kings. But do not go broke, please, with pocket kings on an ace-high board. Now, out of position is a different story. We need to c-bet because I hate this phrase, but we kind of need to see where we're at. I don't like the idea of betting for information, but when you raise, let's say under the gun, you get called and you're out of position. If you check back on an ace-high board, you're almost just giving up the hand at that point, and you don't want to be in the position where you're check calling out of position on an ace-high board and turning your kings into a bluff catcher. Again, could get very expensive. So definitely c-bet the board. It doesn't need to be big. Again, 50% or less, typically in the 40% range. So in position, checking back. Out of position, I believe we need the c-bet. So let's get into some examples. Alright, so what we have here are some hands that I played on Merge, some 6 and 9 man games, and what I just did was filtered some situations that we get into some post-flop play. Delayed c-bets, double barrels, and of course I didn't get every single post-flop play scenario there is. We'll probably need about 5 different videos to go through all the scenarios, but I wanted to highlight some common scenarios that occur, get you thinking a little bit about different plays that we can make, and just show the thought process from flop to turn to river. So here we have a situation where we min raise, and of course we get called by the guy playing 39-17. It's what those players do. It's nice that we have position on them. And also another thing to realize is the pot's getting pretty big and it represents a large portion of our stack, so we need to be careful about our sizing. Now, the question is to ask yourself is, do we c-bet this board or do we do a delayed c-bet? These types of boards can be good to c-bet, and they can also be good for a delayed c-bet. This guy might be more on the loose passive side. If we look at his fold to c-bet, he's only folded one time, or sorry, he's folded 2 out of 3 times. So I wouldn't say that a c-bet is wrong here. And again, I'm not saying you have to do this or that in every specific scenario. Again, we're just thinking about different plays to make, essentially the path of least resistance to steal this pot. We might get check raised on a board like this with flush draws, with pocket pairs, with even ace high, thinking there's no way we hit this flop either. So what I will probably do on a board like this is potentially do that delayed c-bet, and maybe even give ourselves an opportunity to hit our ace. But also, if he has that flush draw and he misses it on the turn, we could potentially take it away on the turn as well, rather than getting check raised. So he goes check check. It's a great scenario. Obviously, we don't have much going on here. Yeah, we have a gut shot, but I'm not really looking to hit a gut shot on the river. I'm happy to just take this pot down now. He went check check. He showed weakness. He didn't hit anything here. I don't want to give him potentially 6 more outs to hit his hand on the river. So let's just take it down now. Then the question is, how much do we bet? Given that he went check check, given that the pot is so big and it's representing a large portion of both of our stacks, and any type of bet will as well, we don't need to even go to 50% here. So this is where I was saying I'm going to go significantly less, because what's he really going to go check, check, and then call with at this point? So betting something along those lines will get the job done. Certainly less than 40%. So let's get into another scenario. So here we raise with ace-9, and we're at the early levels here. Of course, we get called by the blue sky and the small blind. We've another paired board. After filtering out my hands, I figured out that a lot of these occur on these paired boards. But again, this type of board lends itself to some potential check raises by a wide variety of hands from opponents like this. So he checks. We'll do a delayed c-bet. He checks again. Yes, we have a flush draw here. Again, not necessarily looking to hit my flush. Happy to just take down the pot now. And we can go ahead and bet again, less than 50% of the pot, and take it down. So these are some situations that you might want to do a delayed c-bet and get you thinking a little bit more. Would it be wrong to c-bet this board? No. I just think in general, these types of flops might lend itself to the some aggression, or even having him float us, and we might not want to be in a situation where we want to start double barreling. So this can be another way to steal this type of bot with the least amount of resistance. And hopefully we get our stats to change. So we got King Queen on the button. We are going to raise it up, get called, and we've got some overs here. I decided to make a c-bet. Could I have done a delayed c-bet? Sure, this guy's only folding 1 out of 4 times. Maybe I didn't see that. But I decided to do a normal c-bet here for about half the pot. And we get called. We get called by a wide variety of hands here. Of course, it could be a 10, could be a flush draw, straight draw. Could be a wide variety of hands from a player like this loose and passive. Now, here's where I was talking about good turn cards. When a card comes on the turn that could bring a bigger pair, obviously an ace comes out, we can go ahead and represent that ace now by double barreling. And if he has even a 10 or another pocket pair he called with, it's hard for him to continue on a board like this now that we've showed strength that we're going to bet out on this ace. So I go ahead and bet 50% again on that ace, and we get him to fold. So this is what I was talking about in terms of good turn cards. Good turn cards doesn't mean we have to hit our hand, but it could be a good card to represent. So here we are. Looks like we are in the money on a 9-man. Raise it up. We get called. Based upon the stack sizes, the size of the pot, this type of board against this type of opponent, I elect to do a delayed c-bet. I don't really want to get, this is not a situation where I want somebody to potentially float me, call me, because they're going to essentially call my bluff here that I didn't hit this board. And, I'm not going to be in a position to make any type of double barrel, so because of the pot size. So, and of course this is a really good turn card to represent. And we have no showdown value either with 4-5, so we really want to take this down now. Then you think about sizing. Big pot, any type of c-betting will represent a large portion, so we don't really need to bet very big. And we bet well less than 50% of the pot to take it down. So no need to even go to 800 here, or 900 for that matter. So here we have pocket threes, raise it up. Not a bad board to c-bet. 10 high boards are still in those high card type boards. Representing the 10 is pretty easy. Go ahead and bet about half pot. We get called. This could be, he could have had a 4, a 5. He could have had, a 10. Maybe he check raises me with a 10. He could have had another pocket pair that is simply beating us. We can go ahead and do a double barrel here, representing that ace, making it very difficult for him to continue with hands that are even beating us. So go ahead and bet a double barrel. Doesn't need to be half pot. We're representing strength on the ace. So that could be, again, another good turn card to double barrel. Here we have another, looks like this is a 6 max game on the bubble. We got a loose opponent, pretty aggressive opponent here in the blinds. This is a good board to c-bet, as usual. Like I said, the queen high boards are good boards to c-bet. So going to be c-betting that board. Could have potentially gone even smaller, but about 45% of the pot. We get called. And this type of player is simply just not folding to a c-bet. He's folding about half the time on the turn, which is way more than what he's folding on the flop. So I'm going to elect to do a double barrel, but do it very, very small. So if he is doing some floating, calling with a draw, or some other hand that, what he's not folding, obviously he's only folding 14% on the flop, but 50% of the time on the turn. I think this is a good time to do a double barrel, but it doesn't need to be big. We just need to represent strength. And especially that we're on the bubble, one, we need to be careful about our own bet sizing, but he needs to be careful as well that he doesn't start blowing his stack. So we can use that to our advantage and do a double barrel here. Actually, I'm going to skip that hand. So here we are. We are, I believe this is another 9-man bubble. And we get called by like a tight player, but he's kind of passive. Now, this is an interesting hand. Raised a lot of discussion in the Skype group. What do we do on this type of board? We have ace-3, ace-high type of board. My concern here on these types of boards are essentially the value of our chips. We're on the bubble. We don't want to get, I don't want to get too overzealous here with ace, even with top pair. We have a really bad kicker. I'm not looking to get check raised. I'm not looking to play a big pot because of the stack distribution. I'm pretty happy with my stack at the moment, but we have this guy sitting here who is the short stack, so I don't want to put myself in position to lose a ton of chips and risk my stack given the short stack here. So this is one of those rare times where I'm actually going to look to check back my top pair. And we didn't really talk about this in general strategies. I just wanted to point it up again about getting you to think that it doesn't always have to be the mechanic or the robotic style of, oh, we have to c-bet every single time when we hit top pair. It's okay to check back this flop, use some pot control, look to keep the pot small, definitely look to get maybe one street of value at least, but I would imagine if he had a bigger ace he would 3-bet us, but the guys that are calling pre-flop on the bubble here with these types of stats, they can be doing a wide range, but that could include some other aces, and I don't necessarily want to risk getting into too big of a pot here. So we bet about 40% on the turn. If he calls, great. I'll probably check back the river, and since we have obvious showdown value. We don't get called, but I think this is good hand to just think about how to play these so that you don't find yourself in tricky spots for a large portion of your stack when you're on the bubble, where your chips are so valuable and you don't want to be losing them or spewing them away. Alright, so we have a 6-max game here. Look to min raise, or raise a little bit more than min raise, 2.2-ish. We get a call. This type of board, I decide to do a, check it back here. You could argue to c-bet. Obviously, this type of board hits a lot of his range. Queen jacks, we got draws. We've got, obviously a king or 10 is very easily in his range. He folds to a c-bet 33% of the time out of 9 opportunities, so he's not folding a lot. So given those stats, I like to check it back. And again, I decide to do a delayed c-bet on this type of board. Yes, we have a flush draw potential, and that's fine, but I'm not really concerned about hitting my flush. I'm just happy to, let's take down the pot now. And don't think that, what are we really representing here? we may not be representing much, but that's not really the point. We don't need to really balance our range. These guys aren't thinking about what we're representing. They're not thinking through the hands. They're just thinking, what do I have? Can I call a bet on the turn? Obviously, we're betting really small here. It doesn't need to be a big bet, and we could actually even potentially charge draws with this bet and check back the river with showdown value with ace high. So, would a c-bet be wrong? No, I don't think a c-bet would be wrong. But against this type of opponent, I decide to, especially with that stack size, do a delayed c-bet. Again, path of least resistance. Give it about 35% given the board texture, and take it down. So I think we get the point, about when to do a delayed c-bet, or at least just get you thinking about, you don't have to c-bet every single flop, and because everybody expects you to do that. You change up your play a little bit. React to what the board texture is, your opponent, and what you expect your opponent to do on those types of boards. Again, this type of board might lend itself to a check raise. Could have 9-10, could have ace-8. Could be a wide range of hands that a guy like this is going to call with. Obviously, the ace is a good card to represent. We just do 40% and take it down. So I hope that those were some good examples of how to think through some hands, when to do a delayed c-bet, when to c-bet and double barrel. Again, look at some cash game videos about post-flop play that can get into even more depth. But with the style, if you're trying to use some of the strategies that we've talked about in previous videos, you will find yourself in more post-flop scenarios, sometimes when you least expect it, but you also then want to know how to play post-flop effectively so that those plays don't become negative EV plays. So now what I want to do is change gears a little bit and talk about heads-up play, another common topic that just really isn't discussed a whole lot in sit-and-go play. And the heads up is one of those times you're also going to be playing post flop a lot more as well. So that's why I wanted to combine the two. The heads up or the post flop strategies that we talked about will apply for heads up as well. Similar considerations. And again, we're not going to get into every single heads up play scenario because that would take several videos to do. We're going to talk about strategies, considerations, how to play against certain opponents, understanding what opponent you're up against and how that type of opponent typically plays, and of course getting into exploiting players. Exploiting players, what this is all about, and heads-up play is no different. We need to exploit our opponents when we're heads up. I'm sure many of you have seen this chart that's staring you in the face right now. That is your Nash equilibrium chart that many of you might have pasted on the side of your laptop that you're going to play with. And this is obviously the pushing ranges. There's another chart for calling ranges, and that's, I think, at hold'emresources.net. And again, many of you have seen this, many of you use this for heads-up play. So that's all well and good. We're going to be getting away from Nash equilibrium in this chart because I think that chart, we're giving up tons of value. It gets into the unexploitable versus exploitable, which we've talked about a lot. Nash equilibrium is technically unexploitable play, or GTO, which is game theory optimal. The issue is that when you actually do try to play unexploitable and you think that no one can mathematically beat you, what's going to happen is you're just giving up tons of value. You're not adapting to your opponents. You're playing the same strategy that won't be adjusting to your opponent. And many times your opponents are not going to be playing game theory optimal. And ideally, you want to use Nash equilibrium against other opponents that are using Nash as well, therefore they can never get an advantage. Well, that's usually never the case, so it's always going to be in your best interest to be playing exploitable. There are times when to use Nash equilibrium. We'll talk about that in the conclusion, but if you're up against an opponent that has a clear advantage over you, they're a better player than you, you may want to resort to Nash equilibrium so that your opponent doesn't have that much of an advantage over you. You feel that they're maybe going to exploit you more than you can exploit them. That's okay. There are players that are better than us out there. It's okay that we resort to this unexploitable strategy. If you're a newbie in the game and you're really struggling heads up, Nash equilibrium can be a great way to get started into developing your heads up game, understanding how wide you can shove and call, in certain scenarios. So it can be helpful, but when you really want to start maximizing your ROI, maximizing your edge, we have to get into more exploitable play. Natural equilibrium pushing ranges, it leads to very minimal edges and higher variance heads-up play. Here's my general strategy when I'm playing heads-up. I want to test the waters. What can I get away with? You want to find out who you're up against. Is your opponent going to be calling you a lot, folding a lot, 3-betting you a lot? Many times you have no idea. But you should figure that out very, very quickly and then start adjusting from there. And you want to use those first couple hands to figure it out. So I start off every heads-up match by pretty much min-raising. How is this opponent going to react to my min-raise? And I'm also going to use the knowledge that we talked about from session 4, where we analyzed the push-fold game, and where we talked about how raise folding and raise calling with 11, 10, even 9 big blinds, 8 big blinds, can be more profitable than your standard push-fold. That will also apply to the heads-up game. So instead of resorting to push-fold, we can use those huge edges that we had that we talked about in the video 4. We can use that in heads-up play. And remember what the key topic there is. Figure out if your opponent's 3-betting range is any different than their all-in calling range. If it's not that different, you can look to do more raise fold against raise call, and that'll typically be for your ABC regs. So, like I said, start off each heads-up battle min-raising. And then you want to start identifying the tendencies of your opponent very quickly, and of course adapt. So, for example, you min-raise several hands in a row from the button, and your opponent folds every time. That doesn't mean the next time you pick up 7 deuce that you should fold. You want to be raising those hands, every single time. Now, do you want to give your opponent a hand or two to make it look legit? Sure, I can understand folding maybe once out of every 8 times or something like that. But for the most part, I see too many players, they raise, and their opponent folds every time, and then all of a sudden they fold. You don't want to do that. Put your opponent to the test. Aggression usually wins out. So identify your opponent quickly, his tendencies, if they're going to be folding a lot, for example, continue to put the pressure on. And you also want to start each game with the assumption of the player type that you're against. Is it a fish? Is it a reg? Use what we know about those types of players to start, adapting your game. For example, one of the key things that we know about the random players, the fishy players, is that they call way too much pre-flop. So what that means is, and we're going to talk about regs and fishy players individually, but what that means is we probably shouldn't be raising every single button with our trash hands because we're going to be playing post-flop very often. And accordingly, regs, as we know, are probably going to be playing more 3-bet or fold. So we can definitely look to raise a lot more from the button and be more aggressive. Now, again, talking about against the fish. One thing is, don't let them off the hook. And what I mean by that is, don't find yourself calling all-ins, for example, with marginal hands because you might be ahead. Calling a 14 big blind shove with ace deuce. You're going to have a bigger edge against your opponent than going into like a 55-45 coin flip. Be patient. They're going to spew their chips to you. Don't find yourself, again, getting impatient, calling off a large stack with like a marginal ace, like an ace-x, for example. I see that happen way too often. And like I said, you don't want to raise every single button since they typically call way too much. Fold out your trash, it's fine, and even look to limp your middling hands, your 10-8s, your 9-10s, your 6-7s. Hands that could play okay post-flop, keep the pot small, and look to play them in position. And while these fishy players might be playing a lot more hands, being more aggressive, doing a lot of calling, a lot of weird stuff, that doesn't mean we should also be 3-betting them any wider. Our 3-betting range should actually include more of the value hands. Now, our value hands can widen to maybe include hands like King-Jack or Queen-Jack suited, for example. But 3-betting light in general is often a mistake. Okay, so don't look, just because your opponent is random, a fishy player, and they're playing a wide range of hands, they also could be calling with a wide range of hands, which isn't going to be too good if we're going to be 3-betting light. So be careful with 3-betting light. I find that's another often mistake people make, that just because you're up against a random player doesn't mean you should be 3-betting with just like King Deuce, for example. And I think it's perfectly fine to resort to shoving your value hands, the King Jacks, the Ace Fives, with less than 12 big blinds, because like I said, they might be calling stations, playing post flop with a shorter stack could potentially give you some headaches. So I'm okay with doing more of the shoves with your, Ace-X, small pocket pairs, your Broadway type of hands. Now, on the flip side, let's talk about playing against a reg. Like I said, utilizing some of those strategies we talked about in session 4, of playing a more raise-fold, raise-call game. Now, unlike the fishy players, 3-betting light is going to become a necessity, or we're obviously going to get run over. Regs, ABC regs, good regs, whoever it is, most of them know they should be raising almost every single button. But accordingly, they'll typically play fit or fold with 3-bets. So you will definitely need to 3-bet light against your opponent. If you find that they're, for example, raising 80 to 90% of the buttons, then your 3-betting range needs to expand to include maybe even suited connectors, hands like Queen 8, those types of hands. I do plan on having another heads-up video where hopefully we'll get into some more actual hand histories to get into ranges more specifically about, if your opponent's opening 80-90%, what our 3-betting ranges can be. And accordingly, we need to figure out our opponent's patterns and how they adjust. Now, for example, if our opponent starts out and is raising every single button 80-90%, we need, like I said, the 3-bet light. But what if we 3-bet twice and now our opponent isn't raising every single time? They start limping, folding. Our 3-betting range now needs to adjust. We can no longer 3-bet with the same hands because our opponent is no longer raising with the same range of hands. That raising range has tightened up because now they're folding out some of those trash hands or even limping. So that's how you need to adjust. What happens on hand 1 is not necessarily what happens on hand 15. So by the time you get to hand 15, our opponent may have adjusted his opening range, and therefore our 3-betting range needs to adjust. Now, there's also always a discussion on 3-betting versus flatting. Here's just some general rules, I guess you could say. If your opponent is min-raising from the button frequently and you're less than, let's say, 15 big blinds, you're always facing a decision, 3 decisions. You could flat, you could 3-bet, or you could fold. Now, since we're talking about flatting or 3-betting, you have to decide if you're going to 3-bet. First of all, it always comes down to ranges. Put your opponent on a range, and then when you're trying to make your decision, think about, if I'm going to 3-bet, I'm going to 3-bet because I think that this decision will have a higher expected value than flatting. And typically that will be the case when your opponent is raising very frequently from the button. 3-betting will typically be better than flatting. But let's say, again, our opponent's adjusting, maybe they're folding a percentage of their range or limping, and you hold maybe one of those middling hands, the 9-10s, the Jack-10s, the Queen 9s. You might want to look to flat out of position versus those tighter opening range. And I don't have it listed here, but also against the fishy players that might be opening up. Where I said you don't necessarily want to 3-bet light, we can also flat against them with hands that'll flop well and look to play them post-flop rather than 3-betting light. So I think those are some good general rules as to why you would 3-bet and why you would flat. So in conclusion, for heads up, like I said, just wanted to go through some general strategies. But if you're new to heads up play, start with Nash. It is a good basis. It's also good to shove when you're less than 10 big blinds, or good to look at when you're less than 10 big blinds. It can show you just how wide you're able to shove. But if you really want to maximize your profits, maximize your ROI, you need to exploit the player's tendencies and mix up your play. Don't, like I said, use the first couple hands to test the waters, figure out how your opponent's going to react, and then start mixing up your play accordingly. Is your opponent 3-betting a lot? Then we might need to maybe fold out some more hands, limp some more hands, or even expand our calling range. Okay? Now, when you're starting a heads-up match, like I said, You want to identify what player that is. You may not have exact stats, but you could start getting general ideas based upon that population of a player. How do regs normally play? How do loose passive players normally play? Use those general assumptions to get an idea of how to play heads up, and then any piece of information you get from that player, you can start applying to your game. So a few rules of thumb, if you want to say that. Remember, we're not playing like a robot here. Just again, things to keep in mind. If you're playing a loose, fishy player, you want to 3-bet for value. Don't raise every button. You can limp in a little bit, but just overall, be patient. Be patient against those players. You'll catch them. Don't look to 3-bet so light. Don't look to call off your stack so light. Just because you might think you're marginally ahead, you'll be able to have bigger edges on them than hoping for a 60-40. Or sorry, like a 55-45. And against regs, in general, you should be very aggressive. 3-betting light, definitely adapt to them, look to raise the button a lot more, but of course adapting to tendencies. 9 big blinds, it's okay to balance, you want to balance your min-raising hands balance your hands that you're going to min-raise with your junk and inducing hands, just like we talked about in session 4 in terms of that we can min-raise with those hands. But it is okay to become a little bit unbalanced, and with hands like ace-x and small pocket pairs, you don't necessarily want to potentially induce any type of 3-bet shoves where your ace-x could be up against some Broadway hands. It's okay to just jam those hands instead, and min-raise with junk and inducing hands. So I have no problem. You have ace-3, jam it all in with 9, 10 big blinds, rather than have your opponent. Opponents will typically 3-bet lighter in general, heads up. So I like to just shove it all in rather than get our opponent to 3-bet with hands like king-9 when we have ace-4. Because then you're in pretty much, like I said, a 55-45 scenario, which you could potentially avoid, and I don't necessarily want to be in those scenarios a whole lot. And when you're in that 5-15 big blind range, similar to 9 big blinds, where you're doing more min-raising, and you might want to even jam some pocket pairs against certain opponents, but in general, we're not going to be jamming that deep. But of course, we can mix in some limping in, middling hands with around the 15 big blind plus range. So again, rules of thumb, general considerations to make.